Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we celebrate creativity, we're obsessed with story, and we talk to fascinating people to find out what makes them tick. I'm Sean Murphy. You can find out more about me at seanmurphy.net. Today's guest is someone I've been reading and following for a long time, been really looking forward to this conversation, Jacob Silverman. Let me introduce him. Jacob is an independent journalist and co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Easy Money, Cryptocurrency, Casino Capitalism in the Golden Age of Fraud, and author of Terms of Service, Social Media and the Price of Constant Connection. That book came out several years ago, and that's when I first started reading and following Jacob. He's currently working on a book about the reactionary tilt of Silicon Valley elites, which will be published later in 2025. Couldn't be more timely, and we'll talk about that a bit. He writes about so much, but focuses on the politics of tech, surveillance, privacy, the nihilism of forever wars, and the depredations of a clueless media. And the occasional review. He's a contributing editor to the Baffler, the New Republic. He's written for a variety of websites and op-ed pages. Jacob, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
Great to see you too. So let me just start by saying I'm a tremendous fan, and you scratch at least three distinct itches that I'm always pawing at. You have keen insights on the political scene, obviously, but you have been tracking big tech and its malign influence, which I look forward to diving into a bit. But you can also consistently articulate the dysfunctions in both the corporate and academic arenas. So you're an ideal tour guide for America circa 2025. So I can't wait to take a bite out of this. I think the best way to start, because I mean, even since we scheduled this conversation, the world has kept spinning and, a million years have passed. So I would
Sure.
love to know, as a conversation starter, how surprised were you by Trump's reelection?
A little bit. I mean, I think I didn't make any major wagers. We're now all gamblers, it seems. But, um, I thought Kamala would win. I didn't have special insight into the data or the political science of what they might be doing here. But I was a little surprised. I talked to some people before the election. I remember talking to a lawyer who deals with government stuff a lot, and he's like, "I just think Trump's going to win. That he usually overperforms his polling, and it was already, of course, it was close." So I was a bit surprised, but I think it quickly resolves into focus that, like, okay, this makes a lot of sense. We did have this, feckless, kind of uninspiring Democratic candidate. Sure, she was younger and more telegenic than the old half senile guy she was replacing, but the party wasn't fundamentally different. There wasn't something fundamentally different on offer. I mean, we can go through some of that, but we don't need to recite all the faults. But, like, I think unless you're a true dyed-in-the-wool Democrat or some kind of partisan, I think the Democratic loss made a lot of sense, sort of, again, very quickly. Like, you could take quick stock of it and see, like, okay, this is where the people who thought they were going to win were wrong. And this is, they were missing these things the whole time. Like, people were saying, what is summer of 2024? What does Kamala Harris really stand for? And certainly, what does she stand for that's different from Joe Biden? And she said, having a Republican in her cabinet. So, there's always a bit of disbelief around Trump. I mean, I think less so now that we're 8+ years into Trump. But like, how could it be like this? How could it be so absurd and stupid at times? How could people all believe this way? But the motivating factors that give us Trump and that brought him back are still there, and are even there in as we're going to talk about, I think, in greater measure than they were when he was first elected. The problems are not fixed. So the fact that people would gravitate back towards him in itself is not a surprise.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that. And I completely agree. I mean, of course, hindsight, is what it is, but things really did come into to sharp relief. I think one fundamental thing that was very different from 16 and even 20 is this gravitation of big tech firmly into the corner of the right wing, so much so that they were no longer partial to the left. They were also not impartial. They were all in. And of course, a lot of this focused itself around Elon Musk. And I will raise my hand. I think you and and we've taught, I think, we have both kind of bonded over the fact that we're OGs. There are some of us that found Elon Musk to be an insufferable buffoon way before it became, undeniably obvious that there was a lot of hype there. And again, in hindsight, boy, is he a perfect manifestation of so many pathologies in America that have elevated Trump. It's this mythos. It's this style over substance. But I think in hindsight, it's very clear now to see, especially since the election was closer than everyone wants to believe, Elon Musk being all in on Trump, not just financially, but message wise, turned out to be a pretty big deal. And I'll confess, I overlooked how critical that support might have been.
Yeah, I mean, I started writing this book that has ended up, I'm editing it right now. It's going to come out in the fall. And, pardon me. But it ended up being, of course, a lot about the 2024 election because I'm charting the rise of the tech right. And this was something that a few years ago, I mean, it's always been there, of course. And we can talk about the tech industry roots in the military industrial complex or its politics being rather tangled and not purely liberal over the decades. But things, of course, have changed dramatically really since 2016 when Peter Thiel came out as a major Trump backer and when he helped host that meeting at Trump Tower after Trump's election with all these tech CEOs. And that is, to use a really tired term, I mean, that helped sort of normalize Trump among Silicon Valley when he really needed kind of big corporate support and putatively liberal corporate support, I'd say. But these are CEOs and millionaires and billionaires who have a bias towards pro business policies, policies of the right. No matter what sort of more liberal history they may have or where they may have come from or associations one might have with California or the Bay Area, that they're still in the business of making money, of boosting their share prices, of covering up whistleblowers, of hiring fleets of lawyers to deal with the massive theft that is AI. Just any number of kind of shady or untoward actions that are characteristic now of like corporate corruption and political life. Um, in that way, the tech industry is no different than like oil and gas or big law. That's really what I'm trying to say is that like, these are corporate entities first and people who are in service to them. And so that's why, I mean, there's some bipartisanship there, but that's why I think they naturally have gravitated towards the Republican Party in recent years. But more meaningfully, as you were talking about, there's a shared dissatisfaction. I mean, there's a reactionary impulse, of the politics of resentment that you really see in MAGA and Trump, traditional Trump MAGA, as you might call it, and the Silicon Valley reactionary elites. Like these people are all angry, and sometimes they're angry at the same things, or they sort of hold up the same kind of scapegoats or stalking horses. Sometimes they're angry at different things, but they kind of find common cause in that with the faux populism and that there are these corrupt institutions that they want to go after also because they feel like they've been held back from their kind of tech techno-fascist greatness, frankly.
Yes.
Um, that's the Mark Andreessen line practically is that like the government's been debanking us and the Biden administration was oppressing us and didn't want AI companies to exist and all this stuff. And so here is Trump to liberate them in a way, to unshackle them quite literally in terms of they're not going to go to jail for the crimes some of them have probably committed, and get rid of regulations and stuff, and they can fulfill their own great man of technological history kind of destiny. And but to get there, it's this union of resentment, of anger, and we can identify its constituent pieces and what motivates it. But that is the dominant mode, I think, of their politics, and what unites them.
Yeah, I mean, reading the interview with Andreessen in the New York Times a few weeks ago, it was like Groundhog Day. I mean, it's every time we think that there's like four-dimensional chess, it just gets back to this basic resentment. And I feel like, post Reagan era, there was this prevailing ethos of like, as long as you're removing the barriers to getting super wealthy, everything will out. But what's changed, I think, in the last 10 years, and I think Trump just kind of unleashed, is there's always been this cultural resentment on the right wing. And somehow it was no longer enough to just say, I can light $100 bills on fire and laugh at liberals. But now it became almost this, but if people aren't approving of what I'm doing, that's not acceptable anymore. And what I've seen is I think you are continuing to articulate, and it's very important for our socio-political moment, how this is manifested in tech. But I'm seeing it even from like the Dave Chappelle's and Louis C.K.'s. Like the resentment is now, if I'm not being laughed at and approved of all the time, I want to burn the world down. And
Yeah,
it's proving really that money can't buy approbation. So this
yeah,
resentment no longer is at the shoreline of, but I'm wealthy, so F these nerds like you and me that are poking
yeah,
us. And I think that resentment starts to get into the narrative of American culture and how people like Peter Thiel that are just so cringy, and someone like Musk who is so off-putting on so many aesthetic levels that can still have currency amongst these MAGA warriors. To me, that's where the intersection happens. It is like you articulated, this resentment, but I think it goes deeper than just like, yeah, because woke is telling us we can't be funny anymore. It's, I
yeah,
want everyone to approve of everything I say, and social media
yeah.
or gasoline on that.
Well, it's interesting because, in some ways, I've written this somewhere, but like one of the last uses of X, as it's now called, even though it's in its fallen form, is you can still sometimes yell at the rich and powerful. I mean, you sound just like, I mean, I sound just like everyone else, but just, a hysteric from the left, and they probably ignore me. But I that is something that they can't seem to stand. And you're speaking to something that actually is sort of a psychological factor here, but it's very big because they talk about it all the time, which is that over the last 8 years, really since the first Trump election, there's been a more skeptical and sometimes withering gaze at tech, and some of the mainstream journalism outlets have finally saddled up and are doing good investigative reporting and have been for some years now. But after being really behind the eight ball, they find that intolerable. They don't like any criticism of what they're doing. And I get this kind of stuff every day. I'm used to the sort of typical low level, just like journalists on Twitter being abused a little bit. Nothing too crazy to complain about. But
Yeah.
and I'm like, yeah, that this kind of sucks, but it's life online. But for them, all criticism, because I think you're right, they're not used to handling it. Frankly, a lot of them are insecure nerds. I mean, who is more transparently insecure than Musk, with a deep, obvious need to be liked? And he looks at his mentions. We know that, and these people understand, whether it's in the New York Times or on X, that the acclaim isn't universal, and and they that baffles them, that offends them, and that also now in this later form, I think, kind of it angers them and drives that resentment. And so, yeah, I agree with you. Like the target sometimes might be like right now, somehow USAID is supposed to be the author of so many people's problems, like and somehow they're holding that up as the latest enemy. So I think they try to channel in a certain way, like, here's who you should be angry about this week. There are certain touchstones, of course, like government bureaucrats in general, trans people, which Musk is very personally motivated about because
Yep.
his trans daughter, who basically disowned him. So there are there are things there, I think, in terms of themes and policy that they unite on. But then, of course, we also just see the kind of the bogeyman of the week, and especially with Doge now going through various line item expenditures, like every day there's some supposed new item to be angry about that's a sign of corruption.
Yeah, and I think, what's shifted in my perception is, to a certain extent. I mean, it's all been supersized, but this, get the blue collar, get the non-millionaires to fight over the scraps. We have seen that play out. Uh, Immigrants and gay people have been shockingly, consistently reliable boogeymen for the right, where
Yeah.
we would have thought that the shelf date on that hysteria would have died down. It hasn't. But what I want to, with you, since I have this opportunity, I mean, we could, and I would enjoy talking all day about drilling deeper. But I do think, in terms of the work you already do and what is already known amongst people of our tribe, so to speak,
Hmm.
I want to shift into why a lot of this blame can be shifted to how terrible the Democrats are at messaging and narrative, and how a lot of this we could have seen coming, and how do we not have a better way of effectively counter messaging the scapegoating, and making a cause that gets at people's, whatever cliche you want to use, like, you go at their hearts but you need to go at their minds. I think there's an effective way to do both, where you can get people to feel emotional. But what I think, and I'll tee it up for you as thus, my take in a nutshell is, what obviously Republicans are able to do is get people stirred up. But what Democrats are not able to do is, they think that they can go higher, so to speak, not to invoke that cliche, but they can
Hmm.
appeal to the better angels. And what I think they do so terribly is get Democrats, or get non-Democrats to understand this affects you. So regulation affects the way your family can afford to eat, or get sick.
Yeah.
We seem to assume we can be up in this ether of, like, if we are more Christian or we're more inclusive, it's better. Explain how inclusivity and diversity actually gets people better paychecks, and
Yeah.
regulation that helps them. What do you have? I know that's a very broad question, but just in terms of the Democrats being horrible at this,
Hmm.
how are we not learning?
Yeah, I mean, there are two problems there. I mean, one is the messaging and some of the policies broadly, and then some of the policies themselves. But, but they're still, let's just take one sort of tranche here or aspect of this, which is that, like, the warnings about Trump being a threat to democracy, which I think came from a largely earnest and place, and actually, and as we're seeing now, pretty real, but were poorly expressed and weren't, I think, as you're getting at, tied to anything about people's material lives. Because most of us, and I include myself in this, are just like working the middle class people who have bills and are like busy and don't have time to um, have very immediate material concerns, and or maybe have some lurking that you don't know about, and if Trump takes office. And so that's where you say, like, look, this guy's a threat to democracy in that he wants to put billionaires in charge, or like by the time of the election, they could have said he wanted to put Elon Musk in charge. Who he's going to rip out the wiring of the government, privatize everything. We don't know if you're going to get your Social Security checks. You know, things like that. Like, your benefits are actually, pardon me, just had to fiddle with the mic for a sec. Your benefits are actually in jeopardy, and that is, might sound like hysteria, but now is very real, of course. Or like, I think what the Democrats often do, and I've seen some lefties arguing with Ro Khanna recently on social media, and I've kind of gone back and forth, amicably or whatever, peaceably with him, with Ro Khanna, because he is like from Silicon Valley, but is a Democrat, and he tries to do this thing where he acknowledges that the Democrats lost the election and need to change, but he also seems to be taking a lot of the Doge talk and some of the Republican and tech leader talk at face value or good faith. And like, well, if they really want to do this, if they really want to find efficiencies, they should look for these programs or something like that. It's like, Well, one, I think Democrats need to have their own distinct policy, which is that like we actually don't need to cut government spending. Maybe we could cut defense spending. That's the one probably, and intelligence. That's probably the one area where you could really strongly stick to, and where a lot of people have, I think, somewhat effectively said recently, like if they were actually serious about this, that would be where you start.
Right.
But um, what worries me actually right now is that a lot of this sort of austerity push and the cutting of spending ends up being a cover um, for the extension of the Trump tax cuts, which he wants to do, which is a big priority for him. Like, if we just kept things the same, I don't know the numbers offhand, but certainly if we kept things the same and let those tax cuts expire, you could have some tax cuts for lower income people, but let the tax cuts for the rich and corporations expire. Of course, we'd be on a much better financial footing than any sort of Doge inspired cuts, which we know aren't truly about saving money anyway,
Right.
would yield. And so those are the kinds of like I think big picture things. I think also there's a tendency that, and this is the Ro Khanna tendency, which is to like try to do Republican policy better than them or claim you can do it in your messaging and talking. Like we saw that with the border bill, and like I don't know if the Democrats have learned their lesson, which is that going right on immigration but not super far right is not helpful. Well, one, I mean I just disagree with it and don't find it humane, but it hasn't yielded any political fruit for them, and they said like, well, we can be the ones to secure the border, and the Republicans turned down this bill that was their bill and they liked. Well, that no one cares. That didn't work. Um,
Right.
this idea of doing Republican light or doing that it better or more responsibly while appealing to kind of the same, often more sinister, I guess, or
Yeah.
libidinal appetites like being anti-immigrant or securing the border or the jingoism of national security. Like they don't need to do it that way. They can stake out their own more positive vision, that's really tied to people's material living, which should be about, you know, uh, healthcare, cost of living, rent, building housing, the basics and that way also you don't seem insane. You're not talking about bathrooms all the time or whatever else. You seem like a normal person who cares about human flourishing and whatever else.
Yeah, I mean, every time a Democrat comes into power, I write the same thing, and it's like no matter what you do, you're going to be labeled a Marxist and a socialist. So proceed accordingly. Like
Yeah,
if you are, I mean, and as we saw, right, with Obamacare, literally taking Republican ideas and putting them into practice, it's going to be called communist. So that should liberate you, and it never does. So
hmm
that's the kind of the Lucy grabbing the football that I think we're just doomed to repeat, at least
yeah,
until a younger generation takes over. But then the other thing, and as you were talking about it, it kind of crystallized in my mind, like even the most modest nonprofit in circa 2025 has mastered the art of like your $5 donation will do X, Y, and Z. The fact that the Democrats have been unable or unwilling to say, cutting tax, or having the same taxes will build this many, build this many schools, will blah, 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 and really make people connect where there's where the good is being done. And when taxes are cut, you are elevating the tiniest portion. The thing that I will admit has befuddled me, and I think about like my father, who has been telling me for decades now, it doesn't like you can try to demonize the wealthy, but the poorest voters envision themselves. I think it's an H.L. Mencken quote, like they're temporarily, not millionaires or whatever. It's a much more
temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
temporarily
Yeah,
embarrassed millionaires. So I get that, and I get that that's a challenge. But boy, if you can't look at someone like Musk, and I did see something the other day actually that was like, Musk makes $8 million a day, and your Medicaid benefits are $65 a day. Guess which one of these Musk wants to cut? More of that, please. Right?
yeah, yeah. I think those numbers, the absurdity. I mean, a couple things. One of the sort of upsides or benefits with these guys, I mean, the tech elites is they're not very slick and they're not very well presented or always charming. They have a base,
Yeah.
and that we could talk about. But they, once they, especially once they stray out of their field of expertise, which is very easy to do, and they think they know everything, they can sound rather foolish. And I think even in the last week, like there looks like they're succeeding in destroying the CFPB, but there are people who are, on social media and elsewhere who are like, hey, I'm a conservative or I'm a MAGA voter, but this CFPB actually sounds good, or it helped me before, or they've actually seen the numbers, which is that the CFPB has returned something like $21 billion to consumers and costs half that, I think, in its or even less.
Mhm.
Like right now, Musk is talking about he wants the entire CFPB basically account balance return their budget for the next year return to the public. It's something like $710 million. That's $2 per American. This is something that per capita is returning hundreds or thousands of dollars per American per year.
Yeah.
Um, but so when people see stuff like that, like this is like tangible government working for you, like defending you from the assholes gouging you kind of stuff. And the people defending it or the people opposing the CFPB are very obnoxious VCs and billionaires on X who then you immediately type in their company into the CFPB database and you see that they have 7,000 complaints against them, like in the case of Coinbase, and Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, was posting about the CFPB. So, you know, I think there's still some hope there in that, like, there are positive use cases for government. We had the Reagan Revolution like didn't totally win in that regard. Like everything has been hollowed out, and they're trying to hollow it out more. But like when people start not getting their Medicaid coverage or their Social Security checks, it's going to be disastrous. But it could also be hopefully some kind of bottom to this or trigger point for something to change because there are a lot of right wing and conservative people who rely on this stuff. The other thing I think to go back to the messaging,
Yep.
there's a certain lack of honesty and there's a real condescension I think we saw a lot from Democrats in the last cycle, which is that like what are you stupid? Like, you're going to vote for Trump? And especially to lefties or to Arab people who are worried about Gaza and Palestine, it's like, well, look how much worse it's going to get. Well, it's going to get so much. It could get worse, but it's because you helped destroy it. But even so, like there weren't positive appeals to those populations. There was a lot of condescension, like the economy is better than you think it is. This was a line we heard a lot from people.
Yep.
Or Trump will be worse on Gaza. That is not that is not effective, and that no matter what you're selling, and it just contributes to the kind of sort of hostage situation that voting Democrat has become. And the people who I think there are a few Democratic politicians who have some sort of either, if not bipartisan appeal, kind of beyond post partisan even a little bit. Like there were Bernie to Trump voters, like Joe Rogan is the most famous one,
That's right.
and he Bernie went on his show. He Rogan endorsed him or said, I would vote for you, and then he lost. We can go through that, whatever. But like, there are people like that. AOC has that to some extent.
Yep.
You can argue about whether she's, going to be could be nationally effective as a VP or presidential candidate. But like these people who kind of who aren't rigidly speaking in DNC talk and have some appeal to tap into people who are on the couch or who are not voting or who are rightfully, I think, deeply disenchanted. And that is another area that's all about messaging and where Democrats, I think, have just kind of given up. And like, there are people out there, people have heterodox politics. Some people aren't fully informed or are low information. Some people might want to get involved. I mean, there are a lot of variations out there, and it's not just like while we have the partisanship can seem very strict and rigid, I think, in practice and sort of how our government is executed,
Yep.
which I think is true. But in terms of the large mass of kind of politically disconnected people, they're out there, and some of them are able to potentially be activated or at least dragged to the polls.
Yeah, indeed. I guess I'll play devil's advocate and just say, I have certainly grown both, well, wary, but weary of the whining about Fox News and even, waiting for the media to save us. That ship has long since sailed. But another thing I don't think that the Democrats or even just whatever left-leaning progressives have figured out is whether it's the sudden emergence of caravans close to election time or the fact that we don't even hear people talking about inflation and the price of eggs right now. There's a certain element of yes, like so on step A, right? Or point 1.0 is combat that and address those concerns, but it is a boogeyman and it'll be something else for the next cycle. So a positive message that again ties it to where people are, where they live, it is much more effective than hoping that, well, if only the media would cover the fact that, the price of eggs has now gone up. It's like people didn't care about the price of eggs. That's what they were told to care about, and that's what they could rally around. And I think that's why one of the reasons that Bernie really appealed, right, in 2015 and 16 and after was that he was walking the walk and saying, I'm not afraid to articulate why, the Defense Department is bloated. I'm afraid to articulate why billionaires are only interested in themselves. And so I do think these half measures
Yeah.
contribute to the poor messaging, but I just still scratch my head at it's gotten to the point where we really do have the proverbial fat cats smoking cigars in the back room, and we still can't turn them into boogeymen or turn these victims
Yes.
into boogeymen.
I mean, there's a picture I think from Trump's first term of him and Schumer laughing together and sort of like clapping each other on the shoulders. I think in the White House, it's taken from outside the window, and you
Yeah,
may have seen it, or listeners may have seen it as a meme sometimes. It's a total like there's a club and you're not in it kind
yeah,
of scene, and of course they know each other from New York going way back, um, and sorry, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but I can't help but think about that as like, I guess also, yeah, and waiting for people to save us or waiting for the media to kind of come to its senses. I mean, I think there are people who mine sort of a profitable vein of media criticism by complaining about New York Times headlines every day, and certainly New York Times deserves a lot of constant sort of watchdog or criticism,
yeah,
but we're not going to sort of rage post or even sensibly media critique our way to a better
yeah,
media environment or to more, it's still going to be headlines like Trump invokes unique rhetoric on race, or like approaches his fascination with genetic inheritance. Um, we've seen this stuff all the time, and of course, with Israel and Gaza, it's very pronounced. The passive voice and whatever else, and sort of the
right.
laundering for power. Um, so I certainly agree there, and like even though I write for some of these places, and I don't work full time anywhere, and I don't have a lot of faith in their reform. As I think they play a role. I don't have a lot of faith in their reform or ability to serve as kind of pillars of resistance. I'm still like, I'm more glad than not that they exist, but
Right.
yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is there, because anytime you read something in the Times or something like that, and you feel like, is this how you would describe it to like your spouse or just a friend or someone, like of what happened? Like this kind of obfuscating language and like, maybe burying some key detail in, 6 graphs in or something like that. It's like, uh, of course, there's some formalities to journalism, but
Yeah.
you can, if you're an experienced news consumer or a writer of it, you can tell how the tropes that are being employed here and how it masks the truth more than it really communicates it.
Yeah. Um, so I think, again, while I have the golden opportunity of getting insights from you directly, I would say, we talked a bit about messaging and the tech titans and all that. But the through line of a lot of your writing over the last decade has been about, right, us constantly being online. And that, of course, that cuts across partisan lines, it cuts across economic lines. I don't know if I have a question here so much as inviting you to talk about like, I think we would both agree, both facetiously and almost nostalgically, when I read your terms of service, a lot of that is still, of course, very relevant, but it's almost quaint now, right? Like we're in such hyperspace technologically that things that we took for granted, 8 years ago are now like, yeah, that's the old world. But this through line of us all being online all the time, and maybe as it anticipates your book, what am I not asking you, in terms of connecting the dots between, again, big tech titans are now, at least temporarily, firmly aligned with the right. We are all online all the time and everything's bad all the time. But where are pockets of resistance or opportunity or positivity
Hmm.
that you can see, or that you're advising other people to pay attention to?
Sure. I think just right now with Doge and Musk's attempt to take over the government, I mean, people need to understand that this is an administrative coup of a sort, that they are really, I mean, you can read this in the Washington Post. I think it's had some of the best coverage, but also, Wired has been good,
Yes.
404 Media, some of these tech publications, because tech is in the government now. But what they are trying to do fundamentally, besides just fire people or cut programs and things like that, is to usurp the technological and infrastructure functions of government. They want the pay system that disperses trillions of dollars to either go through some private company that they control, or to have their stamp on in some way, to have AI integrated with everything. And I think this is, people may have had some inkling of these kinds of things, but um, that is a very dramatic and kind of profound shift potentially, and I think also just a recipe for breaking things. And I think the resistance comes from uh, a few sources. One, I think you always have to think about labor. Like there are people and a lot of honest middle class people working these jobs at government agencies who
Yeah,
are not, enemies of the people.
of
They
course.
may be bureaucrats, but a lot of them do quite normal work that facilitate the functioning of a huge country. This is
Yes.
one of the great sort of deceptions of the right, and certainly of the tech industry, where they say you can run everything like a startup. Like, we live in a country of 330 million people. Our federal workforce actually is about what it was, I think, 30 or 40 years ago. Like, it's not that big. It's not that big compared to, per capita, compared to a lot of peer countries. You need a lot of people and a lot of systems, unless you want to live in a libertarian hellscape. To and the a lot of these government jobs are stable. They are good for the economy. That people get retirement. So I think we need to understand that, like, this is a federal workforce that a lot of people do respect, that have their own labor protections, that have unions in some cases, or that have civil service protections, which I am not an expert on, but like those
Mhm.
are potentially sites of resistance in especially in how they can there are some of them are already suing, trying to use the courts. I mean,
Yeah.
the federal courts are compromised because there are a lot of Trump judges in there now, but it's still a place where I have some hope that meaningful resistance might happen. Um, so those are two areas where I look to. I think right away. I think also with some of these tech guys, like they might lose interest a little bit. These are people with a lot of financial interests. Musk officially runs like six companies.
Right.
And but also they need to make a lot of money to sustain their lives. Some of them are special government employees, which is nominally something that can only exist for 6 months.
Yeah.
There's a question of how many of these sort of standards are just going to be run over and ignored. Is Musk just going to keep operating this stuff after 6 months, after his special government employee status runs out? Are they just going to roll them over into something else? But and how much will we see that kind of thing, like these various little standards, safeguards, rules, regulations just fade away?
Right.
And that's why I wonder, will the federal courts really be the one there to remain? So these are the things that I look to. I would love to see street protests, and especially maybe as the weather warms, and frankly, as some of the harms and outrages become more visible.
Yeah.
I think, a lot of people don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on. Like,
That's right.
we don't know who works for Doge. There's some lists, ProPublica and Wired or others are putting together lists, but like we don't know its official structure, who works for it. We know some of the people. we don't exactly know what's happening on this supposed transparency initiative. And so it might take some time to find how that resistance forms. But and you know, and not to be, you know, sort of too pious about like citizen media or the power of social media, but like I hope people still keep posting and being angry and like saying what they think and not being cowed by the fact that like there is going to be more censorship on some of the on some of the big social networks. And obviously Musk all along has been promoting right-wing material, his own material on X, and that's the kind of site that he's built. But you know, keep talking. Like we don't live in a totally cowed
That's right.
populace in a totalitarian state, so there's much reason to be disgusted with it. And and the last thing I'd say, though I could probably riff forever, is that like I think also people, you know, the Democrats are deeply flawed and need to be reformed or overthrown or replaced, but they can't be let off the hook or let alone, no matter how much they complain that they are disempowered or that they don't have a majority in anything. Like, you know, reserve some energy for them and for pushing representatives to do something, because otherwise, what's the point of even having them?
Yeah, here. And as you were talking, I thought to myself, not for the first time, that if the Democrats or the progressives can't just take a picture of I think big balls or one of these teenagers and just have the meme or the picture, the poster, the message. Do you want this guy in charge of your social security?
Exactly.
That's going to resonate. No,
Yeah, totally. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Like,
no, just to say you don't need a white paper, you don't need a speech, some effective counterpunching, and it as Kissinger said, right, it has the added benefit of being the truth. Like,
yeah,
do you want this guy in charge of your retirement? And I think a lot of even right-leaning folk are going to be like, of course not. That's what's happening. Wake up.
yeah, yeah. And don't do the, well, if they were serious about government efficiency, they would do this or that or try to meet them halfway. It's like, look who these people are. These are like groypers, 4chan, script kiddies, like, so pardon me if I'm using all this internet slang, but like these are, you know, these are your Zoomer nephew who's a little racist brat but knows how to code is getting a job at Doge. I'm sorry. That's what's happening right now. You know, these are people in Musk's image. Even in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal article about the guy, I think, believe his name was Marco Alez. He's 25, so he's on the older side for Doge. And
Right.
he briefly resigned, but I think was being brought back for racist posts, you know, explicitly very racist.
Yep.
And people are talking about, oh, don't ruin the poor kid's life and all this stuff. Like, um, sorry, I don't know. I kind of forgot where I was going with that, but like, this should be. Oh, I remember what I was gonna say. In the Wall Street Journal article, they're like, Musk often hires people who reflect his views. You know, this is the somewhat sanitized language of the Wall Street Journal, but like, look at what they're saying. Like, a
That's right.
right-wing racist fascist
Yeah.
is executing a takeover of the government, which even the Wall Street Journal has called it that. And he is hiring the little 20-year-old twerps who believe the same stuff that he does.
Yeah. And I think we can agree that that doesn't play well in the heartland. I guess my
Yeah.
fundamental, like my bottom line concern, which I'll take the opportunity to both gloat and cringe in fear, which is I think many of us are very certain that the inevitable breakup between Musk and Trump will be catastrophic, hopefully very mutually damaging. My kind of, I guess it's cynical. My concern since January has been that is inevitable, but will they have already destroyed so much of the infrastructure that, yes, we will enjoy that when it happens. Yes, it'll be wonderful to watch leopard face eating at levels we've never seen. But in the meantime, they're laughing all the way. I think there's a certain amount because you had mentioned, are these guys going to get bored? I think there's no question they are. But at that point, it's like, well, of course we're bored. We already burned the house down. We don't need to sit
Yep.
around it
Yep.
and march on the ashes. We're moving on to our next adventure. Uh,
Yep.
Talk to me about how that jives with you, like whether or not
I
I'm
mean,
that
yeah,
they're going to
it's
break
like
up.
how much damage can they do before they're stopped or slowed in some way, whether that's by their own incompetence or the inevitable Trump must blow up, which I agree, it has to be factored in. It's hard to know how exactly it'll land. Like, it will be very vicious, or will it be because they're two pretty powerful forces? They'll maybe have a sort of détente and go their separate ways.
Yeah,
I could imagine it being vicious too, or even being legal or something. Like, who knows? Will Trump order his arrest? Like anything can really happen.
totally.
They could quietly decide like there's too much at stake, and like I'm gonna go back and run Tesla or whatever.
Yeah.
But it could go all kinds of ways, of course. Or or is Musk gonna go on a drug bender and have to be carted off to Larry Ellison's Hawaiian Island? But and I think we don't know where we'll be left there, and will sort of the opposition, will the Democrats be able to help pick up the pieces,
Right.
or do we get even worse reactionaries to come in and say like this is broken, we can fix it by, becoming a libertarian city state or something like that's the kind of stuff I worry about, and that's where again you have to have the Democrats having a positive or a clear vision that they are pushing all along. Like, this is what we want. This is how we're going to get out of this. If they break this, this is how we're going to put it back together. This
Yeah.
is the kind of government we want and need. And we're not really there right now.
Yeah, and this is probably I'll tee this up for our next discussion, maybe once your book comes out, and we'll celebrate that achievement. Um, I'm sufficiently old, and I mean, I try to genuinely resist cynicism. I don't think I'm a cynic, but it's a very cynical take, which is I think to a certain extent, some of the old guard, for again, lack of a better cliche, on the right, where people are like, how can anyone like McConnell down be stomaching this? And the cynical part of me says they've already factored in, yeah, we're going to lose the midterms, but we're going to get another round of tax breaks. Like it's worth it.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
by the time those tax breaks play out on this 8-year cycle we've seen since at least Reagan, but certainly things will fall apart. We blame it on the government and we stride into office again. I'm also hoping
And
that
they have their judges there that have been there all along. Yeah.
like in other words, again, I can appreciate that this sounds beyond cynical, but I think that there's Republicans that have already made peace with, yeah, we might lose in 26, 28. Doesn't matter. We've already like we got what we needed for the next cycle, and the worst things play out by our messaging. Like infrastructure is going to fall apart. Republican voters are going to wake up and go, hey, my Social Security went away. And Republicans will say, yeah, because the Democrats did that. The big government did that, and it'll work.
Yeah, yeah. I think so. Once you condition people to expect less and less and from the government, which has been a generations long process,
Yeah, long
that
game.
they won't trust the government to be able, or elements of the government to be able to put it back together again.
Right. Right. It's like it's a wonderful self-fulfilling prophecy. It's something that we couldn't cover in this conversation, but it's talking about messaging and narrative, less that sound like boilerplate, because that's what I live in those worlds. Reagan arguably, we talk about FDR or Teddy, with a few very kind of succinct clips, JFK, capturing a generation, saying government is the problem. That's been a long game that arguably I would say if a gun was put to my head, like what is the most profoundly impactful sentence uttered in the last half century? That has been something that is a gift that keeps giving because it helps them enable what they want to do, but it sows that fear and confusion and actually identifies a problem, especially since it's not really the problem. Wow.
Yes.
How do you combat that?
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, one thing you touched on, and I think this is a pocket of hope for me, Jacob.
Hmm.
I think there was a natural tendency amongst progressives to throw up their hands and say, I'm getting offline for my own sanity. Hard to argue with that. I'm disengaging from media because they suck. Hard to talk someone out of that. But you, to me, epitomize why we need to stay in the game. You definitely are a happy warrior, and you spend, uh, you know, full props. Like you go out into those trenches every day. It has to be exhausting other than obviously your own integrity and your belief in the causes that you write about and believe in. What advice do you offer, the younger or older, but the younger cohort that are understandably, just devastated and despondent, how they can make a difference, or how turning off the computers is, while in maybe in measured doses, is we all would agree, like, yeah, take
Yeah.
care of your physical and emotional health, but don't disengage.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think you need to have those breaks, or hopefully just better habits, which we all aspire to. But it doesn't. I'm not really a believer in big dramatic breaks, like throw away your devices or have a huge dramatic fast. If that works for you, fine. But
Right.
more like something sustainable. I mean, frankly, after I finished or turned in the first draft of my book, it let me slightly disengaged a little bit, or feel like I didn't have to have my nose in the Twitter stream like 24/7. But it's
Right.
still, of course, I'm online a lot. And I try to keep also some perspective, like if I find myself arguing with someone, like, do I really want to be doing this? Or like, am I sitting in the same room as my kids and posting at someone on X? Like, I should not be doing that.
Right.
um, things sort of like that. And also just trying to stick to, like, as much as I'm sort of in watching the news cycle and you know, engage with longer things, read books, read long articles, watch movies, watch documentaries or TV, with hopefully without your phone, or maybe just playing a video game if that comforts you. But like kind of longer engagements with things. Also, some of the stuff some of the stuff I read, or I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks, are for work or for research, so there's a historical parallel perhaps. But I like to also listen to stuff that's not purely of the moment. Listen to an audiobook that's history of the JFK administration, whatever it might be. Or I just listened to a World War I book. And if you want to draw those parallels or lessons for the modern era, you can. But I think that kind of perspective is so needed all the time, especially like the people we're kind of up against. They are they lack so much perspective. Musk and Andreessen types, who
Yeah.
are always obsessed with the latest thing to come down the wire, which is usually an inflammatory, misleadingly edited viral video about an immigrant committing a crime. You
Right.
know, we need that perspective, and sometimes that perspective is added by data. Sometimes it's by the sort of historical lens. Sometimes it's by stepping away and slowing your brain down and reading a book or going for a walk, and which are all things I try to do. So, the other thing I would say is, like, if you're involved politically, whether as an activist or you're just a keyboard warrior, which is fine, or you're a writer or whatever else, and certainly if you're a writer, I'd say is develop kind of some expertise, because there's a lot going on, of course, and but if there's something that really interests you or motivates you, and or that you know a lot about,
Yeah.
whether because it's your professional life, like you know something about the environment, so you're interested in EPA policy or whatever else it might be. Like, frankly, the fact that now, like, I used to write about crypto and fraud a lot, and now that crypto fraudsters have kind of taken over the government, people are coming to me a lot to
Yeah.
talk about that. And I find it's useful and worthwhile for me. So, like, I feel like that is useful professionally, but it's also kind of useful for clarity and motivation. You don't have to be an expert on everything, but you can feel good also that you are deep in the weeds on something, that you know how to talk about something or explain something to people, especially because we are living in a confusing time when people say, like, well, what is really going on with XYZ? Maybe then you can be the one to explain that, because that's the thing you've been tracking. So that kind of expertise and respect for that, I think, has been big for me too, in how I kind of consume media, and certainly the kind of journalism I'm trying to do.
That's super inspiring and very helpful, Jacob. I think for anyone listening to this, in terms of pathing, trying to take a meaningful path forward. And again, cliches be damned. That is, I think, is an illustration of, you can become the change you want to see by not getting lost, in the noise, which is partly intentional, right? Either I think, the powers that be, whoever they are on whatever side, want either apathy or just complete overload, and in either scenario, the person's not being effective. Um, you teed up my last question, which is,
Mhm.
and I want to kind of take a moment and really recognize and celebrate the fact that you also epitomize, Jacob, in my humble estimation, someone that is navigating kind of an independent path in an era where that's more necessary, because of media consolidation, because of the tenuous nature, pre 2025, things were not for those of our ilk that maybe we're trying to carve out a more traditional historic path in writing and journalism. But talk a little bit, if you would, just about your own kind of brand building and how this
Sure.
balance between being productive, right? Getting the work done and writing the books, not to mention having a life and a family, but also, not being aloof, where I think the 20th century paradigm is gone, where it's like,
Hmm.
I get my work done and the work speaks for itself. No one cannot have a web presence. No one cannot at least be passingly familiar with marketing and PR as it
Hmm.
relates to getting their work out there. Can you drop a little knowledge? Because I will say it for you. You've done it. You do it very well. And I think a lot of people could learn or at least be inspired by the example that you're setting in real time.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, I should be upfront and say, like, I don't make a good living. I have a spouse who she's a therapist and just, earns a decent middle class living, and that has helped a lot. That kind of stability, or occasionally having, help from family or something like that makes a huge difference in the kinds of choices you can make
Yeah.
and the things you can say no to. I mean, that said, I've taken on corporate jobs and all kinds of things, a lot of things that haven't worked out. Some of the stuff I've written about the travails of being a freelancer
Yeah.
a lot, and I think we've talked about that. Um, I think I used to be a lot more tortured about, sometimes maybe histrionically or annoyingly, about marketing and branding oneself and selling oneself. I've gone over some of that, or just have reached certain kind of accommodations and understand how some of it's necessary. Some of it does represent a little bit of control or freedom. Like, you decide how you want to present yourself, I think, because, you know, I have been on staff briefly, or like for a year at the New Republic, and freelance for them for a decade and written for all these different places. But most of my experience has been as a freelancer or just on my own. And I think what that ends up telling you is that, yeah, you have to decide how you want to, a little bit how you want to be perceived. Of course, you can't control that entirely.
Yeah.
Whether that's like, you know, the voice you choose to adopt on social media, which is largely my own, I think.
Yeah.
And at this point, I'm not holding back so much, or worried about, being hired by a big media organization with its speech codes. Um, and I've also learned, I think, that it, at least for me, and this is one reason why I haven't really fit into corporate life, is it's hard to fake it. So, there are people who kind of, you can perform a character a little bit, but it's hard for me to fake interest in something if I'm really not interested. And that fundamentally is about the work I take on. Sometimes, especially now that I'm doing a little bit better and people come to me with ideas, sometimes I have to say no, or just say, I don't think this is for me. Let me refer you to this other person, which I take a lot of satisfaction in, and I think is just obviously good karma and everything. But
Sure.
be honest about, like, if I say yes to this thing, or if I, and this actually goes back to the expertise thing too, is like, am I going to be interested in this? Am I going to be motivated, especially because I'm a freelancer? Am I gonna, I might not be making a lot of money from this article or whatever else. It might cause me some grief or have a lot of work involved. Am I going to be as excited about this, tomorrow or in a week, when it's actually nose to the grindstone? Or am I going to feel lost or unmotivated, or like I don't actually even know how to do it? And
Yeah.
so that made a difference for me too, is to sort of be a little more judicious in that way. And part of that is also developing an identity for yourself, that, like, and for me, it's largely like, hey, I'm a tech and politics guy, or the politics of tech. I used to write a lot about culture, and I still, write about kind of essayistic stuff about the user experience, or other subjects too. But being able to form that sense of who you are, what you know about, what you want to write, that, and both the subject matter, the kinds of pieces, investigatory op-eds, what fits what subject matter, like all those things, I think, took me a while, and partly because, not, this is just how it was. I didn't go to school for journalism. I went to college and grad school, but didn't study journalism, mostly English and philosophy related stuff.
Mhm.
So I had to kind of learn some of this on my own and made some mistakes, or like decide for a few years I was going to be a book critic when those things didn't really exist anymore. But you find a way, I think, if you're able to follow things that you're really interested in, and that's when you also become more comfortable, promoting yourself, selling yourself, being out there with your peers, and saying, and like that's something I think that's changed for me a lot in the last 5 to 10 years too. Is like feeling like I have this network of peers and other freelancers who, it's not just like it's people who I can reach out to for advice, or for a contact or an email address, or hey, have you ever spoken to this person? Are they crazy? Can I trust them? Any number of things. Have you sold a book? Can you tell me what that's like? That kind of lateral development, and or you could call it professional networking, but for me, especially as a journalist and in a semi-embattered industry, it feels more like camaraderie, and a little bit of community building. I'm not in a union. I've been to a couple freelancer union meetings, but and some of that has happened. A lot of that has happened through social media. There are people even people in New York who I've never met, but now I can text them, or message them on X and be like, hey, I have this issue, or so and so needs a lawyer, any number of things like that. And that all coming together, I think, has really changed how I feel about working in this industry, and kind of my ability to pursue it longer, I think.
I mean, thank you so much for that, Jacob. I mean, again, it's very it's informative, it's inspiring for me, and I think what we've just kind of come around to is a theme that in all the conversations I tend to have are fundamental. It's about balance, and it is this wonderful combination of needing to accept and exist in the world as it is, accepting that things are changing and there's no hack, because even if you do get a shortcut to publication or temporary finances, that could all shift. So having kind of a true north of what you fundamentally want to write or engage in is going to sustain you over that time. And through that process of being authentic, you are cultivating a community which you can both be supported by and support. And I think that is ultimately my ultimate pocket of hope, because as the kind of tides of both politics and socio-political reality in America, those are the things that have been consistent and go back to the 20th century and before, but have remained true. So I think that's great advice, especially for younger people that are trying to figure out, how do I navigate these waters? It's like, I think it's ultimately liberating that there is no one way. But if you find an area to try to cultivate expertise in and do it in an authentic way, things might not work out, but they're going to get you closer to being where
I
you want to
agree.
be than otherwise.
Yeah, and people respond to that. Authenticity can be faked, of course, or come in various degrees, but I think people do respond to it. And so as long as you are committed to the work, and putting that first, and your satisfaction in it and your effort into it at the forefront, I think people will respond to that.
Right on. Well, Jacob, totally appreciate you taking the time. We did, as I hoped, we covered a lot of ground, but I would say, almost inevitably, we were only able to scratch the surface. But I want people to be able to discover you, talk, and I'll put this in all the summary recaps. But
Sure.
people that are like, this guy's unbelievable. It's like, first of all, yeah, but how can people find you and catch up with the stuff you've been doing?
Sure. I'm on X as Silverman Jacob. I'm on Blue Sky. My website's jacobsilverman.com, so all the links are there. Also, my new book is going to come out in the fall. It's called Gilded Rage, and it's available for pre-order. You can also go to gildedrage.com, which leads you just to like a site with some pre-order links.
Fantastic. Well, my only you've given more than enough, but I would love to check back with you. We will celebrate your book in the fall. We'll promote the heck out of it.
Thank
I
you.
can't wait to read it. But let's talk again soon. In the meantime, sincerely, A, thank you for being here, Jacob. But B, thank you for fighting the good fight. It might sound trite, but I think you can tell it's very sincere. Like, in
Certainly.
a time where there aren't a lot of heroes, we need to find these role models and peers that are inspiring us. So I thank you for all the good work you're doing. I hope you're able to take care of yourself too, and enjoy these moments of joy that are available in fleeting doses.
Thank you. Yeah, I still have my health and family.
Right? But that fundamentally, if we have that, then everything can be built from that
There
foundation.
you go.
So to be continued and be well. Thanks for checking out Some Things Considered. You can find out more at seanmurphy.net. Just a reminder, drop us a line, get involved, and support your independent journalists, writers, and artists, because if we can't do it, no one's going to do it for us. Be safe, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.